This week's theme is an important one for a couple of reasons. First of all, it really gets us back into etymology, which is important, and that's the big idea here. After much digging, that's what it's about. The other thing is that it's the first time that we've really needed to get into the kits that we purchased and get the new discs out. So one of the things that I want to point out before I even start is this old theme is in your binders, and it probably is the one that the Word City team worked off of, which is fine. Parts of it are hard to follow. The new theme is better in the sense that it makes more sense, it's clearer. This is the kit, and on there's 2 discs inside. On the chart pictures that I have, I showed you which disc to get it from. I have copies, but the good thing about these new ones is they're very interactive. So when you get inside it on your computer, you're going to be able to watch little movies and things that'll really make this come alive. They're probably not for kid kind of movies. It's, again, for your information. So do make sure that you check that out, but I'm going to take you through the new theme, okay? So first of all, the big ideas of this theme, we are looking at 2 very special families, and again, we're looking at families not as word families in the old sense of rhyming, but they are connected by meaning or origin. And I think one of the interesting things with this set that Melvin doesn't explicitly say, but I'm going to say, is that one of these families is also connected by function, which kind of makes it all make sense. So the big idea here is that it is one of the functions of the orthographic system to signal connections of sense and meaning through connections of spelling. This is etymology. This is what etymology is often concerned with. So we're going to be looking at WH words and the family of them, they, and their. So 2 separate things. This thing teaches that the class of question called WH question words is introduced by an interrogative WH word, that all but one of the WH words has the initial digraph WH, that WH can represent the sound w, w, and in some Englishes, okay, and I'm overemphasizing those for the video. The reasons of the use of the digraph EY rather than AY in the spelling of they. So this theme is a large theme, but it's covering 2 different things, and I think he put them together because it's etymological, and it talks to us about the connections in families. So, important things to remember. These were my recommendations, having now done this twice, because I prepped the old theme and it wasn't very helpful. This theme is about this big idea, etymology, and only uses WH words and the spelling they to get at it. Again, our whole point with kids is that the origin of words and the connectivity based on that origin are links we need to understand and follow. So in some cases you may think that they know how to spell this, or this isn't a question. That's not really the point. We're using the words to get at the deeper meanings. Definitely try to tackle this into 2 separate things. WH, then THEY, and you can talk about the links etymologically of those ideas, but the theme kind of goes through both at the same time, which makes it a little bit confusing. There's also a lot of information in the theme. Only use what's relevant for your kids. Tons and tons and tons of stuff, and in fact I kind of stopped at the end because I thought I don't really think we're going to get there, but if there's things you're interested in, go for the whole thing. Okay, so, wrong page. To start off with the WH words, he does some interesting things talking about sentences, sentence types, grammar. One type of sentence is the interrogative sentence, which basically has to do with questions. And you can have a yes-no sentence where the response is yes or no. The question is yes, or the response to the question is yes or no. Or you can have a question that begins with what we're calling a WH word, WH question word. These questions are introduced by this class of word, most of which, but not all, begin with the digraph WH. These, which we're going to prove, are connected by origin, where they came from, as well as I think this idea of function. They all force the speaker into a question and the listener into an answer. So if kids can connect that idea, they're going to have an easier time with this. The digraph WH is usually only found in the initial position of a word. If it is found in the middle, check that it's not a compound word, which was heavily in the last theme and wasn't really mentioned here, but I still think it's interesting. It usually represents the sound w, and rarely represents the sound. Okay, and we're going to talk about that a little more. These are his new charts that also explain that. One of the things that he talks about is it only represents the H sound when it is followed by an O, which is a nice yes. And you can easily prove that. These words are on the server, and he supplied those as well. So that helps with, of course, the word who. Okay, that starts with a sound more likely. One interesting thing about this that ties back into origin is that most of the words that begin with WH are from Old English. And the spelling used to look like this HW kind of letters. And it's all that phonological type spelling, and it's not easy for me to write up, so just bear with me here. But something that's very interesting is that the sound is beginning to disappear from our language. And I found myself the other day even doing it in a little spelling test where I said when, as you do. You're in a hurry, right? And you say, when are we going? Not when are we going? In British English, it's almost completely disappeared. So one of the interesting things is that he, again, for our knowledge, leads us to understand is this is something called an allophone, and it is understood even though the pronunciation is different. So depending on where you're coming from and what your accent is, you may still put a lot of emphasis on the sound, but more often than not, it's sounding more like a W, which is why kids have trouble with this spelling. We say the word when, and they try to spell it with a W and not the H. They need to link that there is this existence of a digraph WH, only used for question words. Not just only, but primarily used for question words. So that's this bit here that just talks about how you can have a word like dance and dance. We're going to spell it the same depending on how we're pronouncing it. The main thing then, if you got into it, one way that he pitches it is to say to kids, that, and he goes in depth into a third grade spelling book that makes this statement. Who is an illogical spelling? And then argue against it and say, but it's not, proving it throughout your theme. So one of the reasons Melvin says who is perfectly a good spelling is because it's part of a group of words called WH words by orthographic people that are connected and have this function to force questions. Who is part of that? So even though it looks funny, it's written that way for a reason. These are all the words from Old English that force questions that have this pattern. And whether we use a or a or a w, the W or the WH to say it, they're all connected by this. Okay? So helping kids find these and categorizing them as a group is going to help them with spelling them. Not all WH words, though, begin with the digraph WH, which leads us to the word how, which is interesting. Why isn't it spelled W-H-O-W? Melvin has a good guess. Of course, we don't know for sure, but his guess is that because they all came from Old English, and Old English would have spelled it H-W-U, we know from other words they would try to avoid putting the U's together. This would in fact be a triple U. From a handwriting standpoint, a double U and a single U would be a triple U, which they just wouldn't have done. So they probably made some changes in order to avoid that in the writing. There is, though, however, an H and a W still that some, and he says it's a bit of a leap, but it still connects a little bit because the letters are there. He shows a diagram like that, but he says it's a bit of a leap. Irregardless, how is considered part of this WH set. Okay, so that's something you could talk to kids about and show them this version. More information. He has a lot of movies, again, that are not for kids, but more for your information. He has a movie on the disc, page 7, that goes into more depth about the spelling of who, the spelling of what. He notes that kids will often misspell it with an O instead of an A because of sound. Their Kit 2 Theme K talks about how the letter A represents the short A sound when it follows a W. And he can track that with the word was. So that is explored more in Kit 2 Theme K if you're interested in that. If you see this as something your kids want to investigate. The spelling of where he goes into, because sometimes they have trouble, kids have trouble with which where because it has several homophones. linking that based on location as well. So where is a question word, but it also has ties to place. So this is another quick link that you can make. The other thing was the non-standard spelling of wherever, which I thought was fascinating because I had never thought about this before. But he says that many of the WH words can be put into what he calls a single word compound with the base element ever. So you can spell them as whole words. Whenever, whatever, whichever, whoever, however. But if you try to do that with wherever, you end up with a double E. And I believe a double E can only make the long E sound, which would mess up the word ever. So to avoid this, he writes them as two separate words, pretty much standardly. And I thought that was interesting too. There's a movie about this, in particular on page 8. Okay? Then we move into the second part of the theme, which goes into this other family, they, them, and their. This is a little bit shorter. They is a personal pronoun, and Melvin has a great movie on page 4 that you probably could use with upper grade kids, especially if you were just studying pronouns in general. I think it's really good. So I'm not going to go into that. You can see the movie. You need to make sure before you start this theme that you, personally, and potentially your kids, understand the phonology of the phoneme that we're calling long A. Long A can be represented, depending on where it comes in a word, in many different forms. AY and EY, which is what we touch on with they, is only in the final position. This is a graph that we used a couple of themes ago. Melvin has a new one that I'm not really sure is better. It's just very different. I was unable to print it though, but you'll see that on the disc. So we need to make sure that we understand this phonology. The main theme, again, from a textbook, T-H-E-Y, and the textbook says there is no reason T-H-E-Y shouldn't be spelled T-H-A-Y, and Melvin says this is absolutely false. There is a very good reason, and it has to do again with origin. T-H-E-Y has two phonemes, the phoneme representing the TH digraph and then the phoneme for the long A. As spellers, we have to decide which one can come in the final position. We only have two choices, three if you think of IGH, but really two. AY and EY, how do we determine it? We find a relative. The relatives in meaning that go with T-H-E-Y are them and their, and they have an E. So to get that link, we would use an E and not a Y. An E and not an A, yeah. So this is another chart that's on the disc that you can download, and it's really good, yeah. And it also talks about how we can go from the Y to the I and there, and we know that based on that relationship. Okay? So, finally, there's some more information that you could do with this digraph EY, because it can also make two different sounds depending. You can investigate more words that have the A sound at the end when you use the EY digraph. Obey is a nice one. This is a word that I know I've struggled with spelling. I always do want to put an A. And it is connected to the word obedient. And making that link for older kids would also be a good one, and giving them some words to investigate on their own. Another thing for our students in particular are the gray, G-R-A-Y, and G-R-E-Y. Both of those spellings are correct, and they happen to be American and British versions. But if our kids are growing up in a system where we're having lots of different spelling and people coming from all over, this is something to recognize that they're both correct, and we need to value them both. He goes much further into the bound-based element V-E-Y, which is part of this chart, and H-E-Y. I didn't go into that here, but you certainly could if your kids have questions for those words. He also, I think this was interesting, whether is a WH question type word, but it's just not one that we use very much anymore. And in the first kit, he talked about this too, in the older kit. Whether means which of two, and so they would have said, whether of these cakes do you want? Meaning, it would be implied there were only two options. And it's just not a word that we use anymore, as well as whence. It's not a word that is part of our vocabulary, so it's not part of the WH list. However, older kids may come across these and want to put them in. They just need to know that they've fallen out of general usage. Which is another interesting thing that he talked about. English is a living language, and so these changes do happen. We used to say when and now we're not so much. So the language is evolving, even though the spelling, the pronunciation of the language is evolving, even though the spelling is staying the same.